NA6, she said, and her voice surprised her with its steadiness. Record everything. Maximum resolution. Recording. And get me a secure channel to command. Encrypted, priority 1. Unable to establish secure connection. Signal jamming detected across all standard frequencies. Of course there is. Elena's hands moved to her weapons console and then stopped, hovering above it. She made herself breathe. She made herself think. Scout ships carried minimal armaments. They were designed for observation and evasion, not engagement. Fast, quiet, and about as useful in a military confrontation as a strongly worded letter. The Vax Corey force on the ground was substantial. The probability of any intervention being effective rather than simply suicidal was vanishingly small. Her training was unambiguous on this point. Document, report, withdraw. Another group of Telerans was being driven out of the outpost. Smaller figures moved among them, juvenile forms, barely half the height of the adults, their antennae trembling. Children, by any definition that mattered. Elena stared at the display for a long moment. NA6, she said quietly, if I perform a low-altitude strafing run against the Vax Corey ground forces, what's our survival probability? The eye's pause felt almost human. Calculating. 17.3% chance of successful intervention and escape. A short, hollow laugh escaped her. Those are catastrophically bad odds. Confirmed. She pulled up the weapons panel and began arming her pulse cannons. Good thing I've always had terrible taste in probability assessments. She took them by complete surprise, which was the only reason it worked at all. Elena drove her ship into the atmosphere at maximum speed, screaming down through cloud cover before the Vax Corey had any indication she existed. The pulse cannons carved through their rear formation like a blade through paper, scattering armored bodies in all directions and setting 3 of their ground vehicles burning. The chaos that followed lasted perhaps 90 seconds, but 90 seconds was enough. Telerans bolted for the tree line in every direction, scrambling over each other in their desperation to reach the cover of the forest. Juvenile forms clutched to adult bodies with forearmed urgency. Then the Vax Corey recovered. Return fire came from everywhere simultaneously, filling the sky with burning plasma that turned the morning into something closer to noon. Elena rolled hard, pulling G-forces that grayed the edges of her vision, and felt the ship buck violently as something struck her port stabilizer. Warning. Hull breach. Stabilizer offline. Port thrusters reduced to 40%. Yeah, I noticed, she said through her teeth, wresting controls as the ship lurched sideways like a drunk in a crosswind. NA6. Emergency extraction. Full burn. Get us out of the atmosphere. The ship screamed upward, trailing smoke and fire, alarms shrieking from every panel as the atmosphere fell away and the stars returned. 2 Vax Corey cruisers had already broken orbit to pursue her, their engines burning hard on an intercept trajectory. But scout ships, even damaged ones, were designed to be fast. Elena pushed every system past its rated limits and didn't look back. Damage assessment, NA6 reported with a perpetual, infuriating serenity. Life support at 64%. Engines at 41%. Hull integrity compromised in 3 sectors. Estimated flight capability, 7.2 hours remaining. Elena checked navigation. The nearest human outpost was 6.9 hours away. She stared at that number for a moment, then leaned back and let out a long, shaking breath that she hadn't realized she'd been holding for the past 20 minutes. "Hey," she said softly. Her hands were trembling. She noticed this with a kind of distant curiosity, as though observing someone else's hands, someone who had just watched children nearly be executed and had probably broken 17 regulations doing something about it. On her secondary monitor, the footage continued to play. She watched it for a long time, alone in the dark between stars, and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd seen. The briefing room at Orbital Command had seen grim news before. Wars had been announced here, disasters reported, crises managed with the cold efficiency of professional necessity. But nothing quite like this. Admiral Chen's face had gone the color of old concrete as the recording reached its end. Around the long table, military officers, intelligence analysts, and diplomatic corps representatives sat in a silence so complete that Elena could hear the ventilation system cycling. Several people were staring at the table. Several more were staring at nothing at all. still wearing the medical monitoring sensors from her emergency treatment. Her ship had made it with 11 minutes to spare. Elena sat at the far end of the table and said nothing. She had already said everything she had to say. The footage had said the rest. This footage is confirmed authentic. Admiral Chen finally asked. Her voice was very controlled. Witnessed and recorded by me personally, Admiral. No post-processing, no alterations. What you saw is what I saw. Another silence. Barbaric, muttered General Okafor, a man who had spent 30 years in uniform and clearly did not use that word lightly. Absolutely and completely barbaric. Ambassador Katri was already typing furiously on her datapad, her diplomatic instincts cutting through the shock faster than most. We need to bring this before the Galactic Confederacy immediately. What we just witnessed violates at least 7 interstellar treaties, including the Kessery Accords on the treatment of non-combatants. The systematic execution of surrendering scientists, children among them. She stopped, composed herself. This demands an immediate, formal response. Admiral Chen looked at Elena. You did a very dangerous and very regulation-breaking thing out there, Lieutenant. Yes, Admiral. You also saved an unknown number of lives. Elena said nothing. I'll be considering how to weigh those two facts against each other. The Admiral paused. In the meantime, get some rest. This is far from over. 3 days later, Elena stood at the back of the Galactic Confederacy's Grand Chamber and watched her optimism slowly, systematically die. The chamber was breathtaking by any standard, a vast, circular space designed to accommodate the representatives of 200 species, its architecture a deliberate fusion of forms that no single civilization could claim as its own. Light came from everywhere and nowhere, soft and neutral. The air carried trace elements calibrated to the respiratory preferences of dozens of species simultaneously. It was, in every physical sense, a monument to cooperation. Ambassador Katri stood at the central podium, her voice steady and clear, as Elena's footage played across every screen in the chamber. As you can see, Katri concluded, this unprovoked attack on a peaceful research outpost, the systematic execution of surrendering scientists, including juvenile members of the Telerans research team, demands immediate and unequivocal Confederacy intervention. The victims were non-combatants. They posed no military threat. They surrendered completely and were murdered for it. The footage ended. Elena watched the faces of 200 representatives with the careful attention of someone who had been trained to read threat assessments. What she saw made something cold settle into the center of her chest. They weren't horrified. They were politely uncomfortable, which was an entirely different thing. The Confederacy's arbiter, a towering avian being, feathered and ancient, whose species had guided galactic governance for 3 centuries, clicked his beak in a way that Elena's xenocultural briefings had identified as the equivalent of a shrug. The Vax Corey delegation wishes to respond, he announced. A reptilian diplomat rose from the far side of the chamber, his scales shimmering with an iridescent quality that Elena might have found beautiful under different circumstances. He straightened unhurriedly, radiating the specific confidence of someone who was never seriously expected to be contradicted. These operations are a matter of Vax Corey security and sovereignty, he said smoothly. The Telerans researchers were conducting biological studies with direct implications for our species' defense capabilities. We acted within our recognized rights to protect our people. Rights. Ambassador Katri's composure fractured, just slightly. You're calling the execution of children a right. A murmur ran through the chamber. Elena listened to it carefully. It was not outrage. It was a particular discomfort of an audience watching someone violate the unspoken rules of decorum, the murmur of people who felt that Katri's emotional display was a problem in the room, rather than the footage that had preceded it. The arbiter tapped his ceremonial staff with quiet authority. The Confederacy has long maintained a foundational policy of non-interference in security matters between species. This principle has been the cornerstone of galactic peace for 400 years. Peace, Elena said, and realized she'd spoken aloud only after the word was already in the air. Every head in her section turned. The arbiter's gaze found her, cold, precise, the look of someone with 4 centuries of institutional authority behind his eyes. Lieutenant Rodriguez, you are present in this chamber as a witness to events, not as a diplomat. With respect, sir, those aren't mutually exclusive. She kept her voice level. I witnessed a massacre. I'm providing witness testimony. The Vax Corey diplomat's mouth stretched into an expression that might charitably be called a smile. Perhaps the humans lack the experience to understand how galactic civilization actually functions. His tone was that of an adult addressing a child who has made an embarrassing social error. Strong species protect their interests. Weak species adapt or make way. This is not cruelty. It is simply the nature of civilizational development. The murmur this time was different. Around the chamber, dozens of representatives were nodding, not enthusiastically, but in the way people nod when someone has articulated something that everyone in the room privately believes but considers impolite to state directly. Elena felt the full horror of it settle over her like cold water. It wasn't just that the Vax Corey committed atrocities. She had grasped that on XJ-42. What she understood now, watching those nods ripple around the chamber, was something far more terrible. The galaxy knew, and the galaxy had quietly decided that knowing was acceptable, that the price of non-interference was other species' lives, and that this was, on balance, a reasonable price to pay. Ambassador Katri tried 3 more times, each attempt more exhausted than the last. The arbiter used words like proportionality and sovereignty in historical context in the measured tones of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of saying nothing with great authority. The session ended without resolution, without censure, without even a formal investigation. As Elena and Katri walked out into the corridor, Elena caught the ambassador's arm. They are not going to do anything. Katri's face was grim and set, the face of someone who has just watched years of diplomatic faith receive a decisive answer. No, she said simply, but we are. The United Earth Council emergency session was the most heavily attended in living memory. Representatives from every human colony in the settled systems had traveled to Earth by shuttle, by private transport, by anything with an engine, filling the circular chamber to capacity and beyond. The overflow crowds watched on screens in the corridors outside. Elena had never seen anything like it, the particular energy of a civilization confronting something it could not look away from. She was still processing what it meant when General Okafor stepped to the podium. Military intervention represents our only credible response, he stated, his deep voice carrying to the farthest seat. We cannot allow these atrocities to continue while remaining uninvolved. The Vax Corey will interpret inaction as permission. Secretary of State Alvarez responded with the careful weariness of a man who had been running strategic calculations since the footage first aired. The Vax Corey possess technological capabilities centuries beyond our current development. Their empire spans dozens of star systems with deep, established infrastructure. Any direct military engagement would not be asymmetrical, it would be catastrophic. So the answer is to watch. Elena asked from the witness stand, and felt the room shift slightly toward her. With respect, Secretary, that's not strategy. That's cowardice wearing strategy's clothes. A beat of surprised silence. Admiral Chen raised her hand before the Secretary could respond. Lieutenant Rodriguez, the Council appreciates your candor, but strategic considerations require. With respect, Admiral, strategic considerations didn't stop me from making that strafing run. Elena looked around the chamber, at all those faces watching her. I had a 17% survival probability. I made the run anyway because the alternative was sitting in orbit watching children get shot. She paused. I don't think the math changes just because more lives are at stake. I think it gets more urgent. Director Park of Intelligence Services stepped forward, saving the room from having to respond to that directly. He activated a holographic display that cast the chamber in soft blue light. New intelligence is relevant to this discussion, he said. Our analysis of Vax Corey expansion patterns over the past 3 centuries shows a consistent methodology. They have absorbed, displaced, or systematically eliminated at least 7 known spacefaring species during this period. He paused on the word displaced, letting its polite inadequacy hang in the air. The Telerans were specifically targeted because their medical research represented a potential challenge to Vax Corey biological warfare capabilities. Our assessment indicates that humanity may be next on this list. Our genetic adaptability poses an analogous threat to their strategic doctrine. Ambassador Katri added quietly, the diplomatic corps has identified something else. Several minor species have gone silent within Confederacy space over the past decade. Not diplomatically silent, Silent. No transmissions. No trade activity. No census data. All of them had territories adjacent to Vax Corey expansion zones. She let the implication breathe. We're not talking about what might happen. We're talking about what has been happening continuously for a very long time. The chamber was very still. President Mbeki had been listening from her seat without speaking, a quality of attention about her that the room had slowly oriented toward without anyone consciously deciding to. She was not a dramatic woman by nature. Her presidency had been defined by careful, deliberate governance, but when she rose, the weight of what she was about to say was already visible in the set of her shoulders. I want to tell you something that every human history student learns before they finish secondary school, she said. Her voice was quiet, which made it carry further than any shout. It is a pattern that is repeated throughout our species' existence on Earth, and it has cost us enormously every single time it is played out. She looked slowly around the chamber. One group decides that another is beneath consideration, expendable, a problem to be managed rather than a people to be respected. And then good, reasonable, strategic-minded people look at the situation and decide that it is not their problem. They have their own concerns. The political cost is too high. The odds are too poor. The cultural differences are too significant for genuine understanding. And so they wait, and they calculate, and they find excellent reasons why action is impossible while the killing continues. She paused. From the Holocaust to the Rwandan genocide to the climate refugee crisis to the Mars colony purge, each catastrophe announced itself in advance. Each one had witnesses who chose to be only witnesses. And each time, after the full scale of the horror became undeniable, we said the words that we have said more times than I care to count. Her voice dropped. Never again. The chamber was absolutely silent. I will not stand before whatever tribunal history eventually convenes and explain that humanity watched a genocide from a comfortable distance because the tactical assessments were unfavorable. She looked at Okafor, at Alvarez, at Chen, at every face in the room. I will not add another species extinction to the list of things we permitted because intervening was inconvenient. One by one, the colony representatives stood. Never again, said the delegate from Mars, quietly and with great certainty. Never again, said Europa. Never again. Titan, Proxima, New Eden. The phrase moved through the chamber like a tide coming in, growing with each voice, becoming something larger than the sum of its words. President Mbeki waited until the last echo faded. The motion carries unanimously. Humanity will not stand by. Commander Jackson Quinn was, by any conventional metric, completely wrong for this assignment. He had been decorated 3 times for action in the Proxima conflict, which qualified him. He was widely considered the most tactically creative officer in the United Earth Navy, which made him essential. He also possessed what his fitness reports consistently described, in the careful language of military bureaucracy, as an unconventional approach to command culture, which was a professional way of saying that his first word to the assembled officers of his new task force, packed into the briefing room aboard the UES Thermopylae, were delivered with a grin that suggested he found the entire situation delightful. At ease, everyone, take a seat. We have quite a lot to cover before we all die gloriously for a species most of you have never personally met, and I'd like us to be comfortable while we plan it. The nervous laughter was, Elena suspected, the intended response. Quinn activated the holographic display, letting the tactical data paint itself across the air above the table. This is Operation History Lesson. Earth High Command has given us 30 days to assemble the most effective fighting force in human history. His grin faded into something harder and more genuine. After that, we deployed to Vax Corey space to interrupt their next scheduled atrocity. Intelligence has identified a Telerans research outpost in the Aegis sector as their next target. We will be there first. He looked around the room, at the ship captains, the Marine commanders, the Special Forces officers, the intelligence analysts. The finest military minds that human space had produced, pulled from their regular postings with minimal explanation and an unusual amount of authority attached to the orders. So, said Captain Singh carefully, the Vax Corey outmatches technologically in almost every category. Almost, Quinn said, and the emphasis carried the weight of a carefully kept secret. That word is doing tremendous work in your sentence, Captain, and I'm glad you left it in. The Vax Corey have not encountered our phase shift technology. They have never faced our quantum torpedoes. Both were developed well after our last official contact with the Empire. He gestured to Elena. Lieutenant Rodriguez, intelligence assessment. Elena stepped forward, pulling up the analysis she'd been compiling since the moment Admiral Chen had assigned her to Quinn's staff. The Vax Corey have a significant doctrinal blind spot. They have enjoyed overwhelming technological superiority against every opponent they've faced for over a century. That kind of sustained advantage creates complacency. It breeds a combat doctrine that is rigid and formulaic, because it has never needed to be anything else. They expect their enemies to behave in predictable ways, because every enemy they've encountered has had the same fundamental limitations. We have different limitations, Quinn said, which means we'll be unpredictable. Our tactical simulations suggest their vessels emphasize concentrated frontal firepower, impressive, overwhelming, and completely dependent on their opponents engaging in the frontal arcs they are optimized for. He pulled up the Vax Corey ship schematics that Elena had extracted from the XJ-42 footage. Point defense systems are minimal. Engine configurations have exploitable geometric vulnerabilities, and their command doctrine centralizes tactical decision-making in ways that create systematic gaps when their assumptions are violated. The briefing continued for hours, and then became days, and then became 3 weeks of the most exhausting, relentless preparation Elena had ever experienced. Quinn drove his task force like a man who understood, with complete clarity, exactly what the cost of failure would be. The failed simulations were legendary. He reset them without drama, cataloging each defeat with sardonic efficiency. Excellent. We've discovered another way for everyone to die. Let's find the remaining ones and eliminate them systematically. Failed tactics were dissected, revised, and retested within hours. Engineers worked around the clock modifying fighters with experimental cloaking systems. Marine units trained in new powered armor while simultaneously developing counter-doctrines against Vax Corey weapons configurations. Elena found herself working 18-hour days and not caring, because the alternative was thinking about what failure would mean for the beings on that planet in the Aegis sector. On the eve of deployment, Quinn gathered his task force commanders in the Thermopylae's main briefing room. He sat on the edge of the table, which was the most casual Elena had ever seen him, and looked at each face in turn. "Tomorrow we jump," he said, and his voice had none of its usual performance in it, just the honest weight of the moment. Intelligence has confirmed the Vax Corey are moving against the Aegis sector outpost. The timeline is tight. We need to be in position before they begin their operation. He was quiet for a moment. I won't tell you the odds are good, because they aren't. Any officer who's run the numbers knows what we're walking into. His eyes moved around the room. What I will tell you is this. Humanity has spent several thousand years perfecting the art of organized violence, mostly against ourselves, which has been catastrophically wasteful and profoundly stupid. We have, however, gotten extraordinarily good at it. He let the grin return, slower and more genuine this time. I am genuinely pleased that we found a use of that expertise which I can feel good about. Quiet laughter, the kind that comes from the chest rather than the throat. Questions. Silence. Then get some rest. He stood, gathering himself. Tomorrow we teach the Vax Corey that war crimes have consequences when humans are paying attention. The Aegis system looked quiet from FTL approach distance. A yellow-orange star, 6 planets in clean orbital paths. The 4th one, blue-green and cloud-wrapped, the kind of world that looked peaceful from any angle, showed nothing unusual on long-range passive scan. Then the Thermopylae's sensors cut through the passive picture, and the tactical display lit up like a threat assessment nightmare. 17 Vax Corey warships in orbital formation. Troop carriers already in descent trajectory. Ground forces deploying in their characteristic encirclement pattern around the northern continent's research outpost. Right on schedule, Quinn said from the command chair, not smugly, with the satisfaction of a plan making contact with reality and surviving. All ships, battle stations. Fighters, prepare for launch. We have a window before they begin their surface operation, and I want to be inside their defensive perimeter when we announce ourselves. Elena's station painted the picture in real time as a human fleet accelerated on its approach vector, stealth systems holding against the passive Vax Corey sensor net. On the planet below, Teleran life signs clustered in the outpost, hundreds of them, unaware that both their executioners and their rescue were converging simultaneously. 5 minutes of optimal engagement range, reported the tactical officer. Quinn keyed the fleet-wide channel. His voice, when it came, was measured and calm and carried something in it that Elena would later struggle to name. Not inspiration exactly, but the specific gravity of a person who means every word they say. This is Commander Quinn. In 5 minutes, we are going to intervene in a situation that most of the galaxy has decided is none of our concern. History has a great deal to say about moments like this one, and almost none of it is kind to the people who chose to watch. A pause. We are not watching. All ships, execute on my mark. The Vax Corey commander was broadcasting surrender demands to the Teleran outpost when 6 human warships and their full complement of fighters materialized from stealth, already inside his defensive formation, already deploying. The reptilian face on Quinn's view screen cycled through surprise, recalibration, and recovered arrogance with the speed of genuine practice. Human vessels. This matter is outside your jurisdiction. Withdraw immediately or face the full response of Vax Corey military authority. Quinn sighed with theatrical weight. They always choose a hard way. Every single time. He cut the channel. All ships, execute battle plan Thermopylae. The battle was loud and fast and absolutely nothing like the simulations, which was exactly what Quinn had predicted. The Vax Corey were technically superior in almost every system that showed up in a pre-engagement analysis. What the analysis couldn't capture was a specific paralysis that descends on a force whose assumptions about an engagement have been violated simultaneously on every axis. Their frontal arc fire concentrations were devastating to an enemy in front of them. The human fleet hit them from vectors that their doctrine had never required them to defend. Quantum torpedoes bypassed their shields entirely, finding engine sections that no one had thought to harden because no one had ever threatened them from that angle before. Human fighters running phase shift technology slid through point defense fire that should have been impenetrable, delivering their ordnance and vanishing back into phase before the targeting systems could adjust. On the planet's surface, Vax Corey ground forces, distracted by the chaos overhead, found their encirclement suddenly disrupted. Dropships came in fast and hard through confusion, human marines in powered armor hitting the ground between the attackers and the Teleran outpost, establishing a defensive line in the time it took the Vax Corey to understand what was happening. 60% evacuation complete, Elena reported, watching the shuttle icons track on her display. 10 minutes until all Telerans are aboard. We may not have 10 minutes, Quinn said quietly, watching the tactical board. 3 Vax Corey cruisers were disabled, one already venting atmosphere, its crew in emergency pods. The others had recovered from their initial disorientation and were coordinating. The technological gap was beginning to reassert itself. The Shackleton took a direct hit to its forward section, lurching sideways on the display. Destroyer Shackleton reports damage, the tactical officer said. 5 casualties, 22 wounded. Quinn's expression changed in a way that was different from tactical assessment. Those names reached my desk before we jump. Every single one. Elena watched the evacuation counters tick upward, willing them faster. 80%. 90. 95. Last evacuation shuttle has cleared the atmosphere. All Teleran personnel accounted for. Full retreat. Quinn ordered immediately. All ships disengage. Jump coordinates already distributed. Execute on my mark. The human fleet pulled back, towing a captured Vax Corey command vessel, its systems locked in its crew in secured compartments. Around them, the remaining Vax Corey ships were regrouping, but the human fleet was already accelerating to jump velocity, and pursuit at this range would accomplish nothing. The stars elongated into light, and the Aegis system fell away behind them. In the secure interrogation chamber of the captured command vessel, Elena faced the Vax Corey commander across a narrow table. He was restrained but not harmed, his scales flushed with particular coloration that Teleran xenobiological research, she had done her homework, indicated combined anger with profound disorientation. He stared at her for a long time before speaking. Why? The translator rendered it precisely. Your species risked war, risked annihilation, for beings who offered you nothing, who are nothing in the hierarchy of galactic civilization. Why? Elena looked at him. She thought about the right answer, the diplomatic answer, The strategic answer, the answer that would translate cleanly across a species barrier into something a mind built on hierarchical thinking could process. Then she told him the true one. Because we used to be you. He went very still. Not us specifically. We never had FTL capability during our darkest periods, so we couldn't execute what you're executing. But the thinking, the logic that says some lives matter and some lives don't, that strength grants a right to eliminate whatever inconveniences it. She held his gaze. We did that to each other for thousands of years. We did it with extraordinary efficiency and creativity and absolutely devastating thoroughness. And we paid for it in ways that we are still, today, still paying for. Quinn stepped into the chamber from the doorway, where he had apparently been listening. He crossed to the table and looked down at the commander with an expression that was neither angry nor pitying, simply direct. Killing the defenseless takes no strength, he said. Any coward with a functioning weapon can do it. We learned that the hard way. He leaned forward slightly. What we also learned, slowly, at tremendous cost, is that the only measure of civilization that actually means anything is this. Who do you stand between the predator and the prey? A pause. Humanity has spent centuries being both. We know what both sides of that line feel like. That's exactly why we know which side we choose to be on. The Vax Corey commander looked at them both for a long moment. He said nothing, but something behind his eyes shifted. Not agreement. Not yet, perhaps not ever. Something more fragile than that. The particular look of a certainty that has just been asked a question it has never had to answer before. Supreme Commander Sovik's broadcast reached every communication channel in Confederacy space within 48 hours of the Aegis engagement. He was composed. He was authoritative. He was impressively convincing to anyone who hadn't been in the Aegis system. Behind him, carefully selected footage showed disabled human vessels and retreating ships, framed with meticulous skill to suggest a failed aggressive incursion rather than a successful rescue operation. The unprovoked attack on Vax Corey peacekeeping forces constitutes an unambiguous act of war, he announced, his voice carrying the offended dignity of a species that had just been challenged for the first time in living memory. Humanity has demonstrated that it cannot be trusted to exist unsupervised within civilized space. Peacekeeping forces. Elena watched the broadcast from the Thermopylae's mess hall, surrounded by off-duty personnel who had gone very quiet. That's creative, she said. Propaganda 101, Quinn agreed, dropping into the seat across from her with a cup of coffee. Control the narrative before anyone else can establish it. They're good at this. The Galactic Confederacy's arbiter appeared on the screen next. The Confederacy formally censures humanity for their disruptive and unauthorized military intervention. Such unilateral actions represent a fundamental threat to the galactic peace that the Confederacy exists to preserve. The peace of the graveyard, muttered a Marine lieutenant several tables away. Not quietly enough. Nobody corrected her. The alarm started an hour later. Multiple Vax Corey battle groups had entered human space simultaneously, a coordinated assault across several vectors, clearly planned well in advance of Aegis, waiting only for sufficient provocation. New Eden colony under attack. Proxima Centauri with enemy ships in orbit. Long-range sensors tracking additional forces moving toward Terra Nova and Epsilon Eridani. Quinn stood in the mess hall doorway, looking at the tactical alert on the wall display. His coffee was untouched in his hand. So it begins, he said quietly. The next 3 weeks were the worst Elena had ever lived through, and she had once survived a controlled crash landing on a planet with no breathable atmosphere. Human forces spread thin across too many systems, fighting holding actions while civilians evacuated, sacrificing position after position in managed retreats designed to buy hours rather than hold territory. The technological gap that the Aegis engagement had briefly obscured through the element of surprise reasserted itself with brutal clarity. The Vax Corey were adapting, studying the phase shift technology, developing countermeasures, systematically closing the advantages that Quinn's task force had exploited. On New Eden, a Marine battalion held the main spaceport for 12 hours against overwhelming odds, a grinding, room-by-room defense that allowed 30,000 colonists to reach evacuation transports before the position was finally lost. Elena read the casualty reports from her coordination post on Earth and felt something shift permanently in her understanding of what courage actually looked like, not the sudden, dramatic version she'd experienced over XJ-42, but the sustained, exhausted, deliberately chosen version. The kind that continued hour after hour after hour. The destroyer Endurance intercepted a Vax Corey bombardment trajectory over the main Proxima settlement, placing itself between the incoming fire and 70,000 people who never saw it happen. The ship was lost with all hands. The settlement survived. Elena added those names to the list she kept, separate from the official records, because she needed to remember them as individuals rather than statistics. Vax Corey propaganda painted humanity as exactly what the Confederacy had long quietly suspected: primitive, violent, dangerously unstable, a species that had never learned its proper place in the natural order and was now proving it by dragging the galaxy into unnecessary conflict. Several Confederacy member species issued formal statements of neutrality that read, between their diplomatic lines, as tacit approval of the Vax Corey campaign. "They are succeeding," Ambassador Catry said grimly during a crisis meeting, watching the neutrality declaration stack up. "Not militarily yet, but narratively. They are making us the aggressor." "Then we change the narrative," Elena said. She pulled up the intelligence analysis she'd been constructing for 2 weeks, patterns and communication data from species along Vax Corey expansion zones, evidence gathered painstakingly through covert observation posts and encrypted transmission from sources who had been silent for years because they had no reason to believe anyone was listening. "There are species throughout the Confederacy who have been waiting for this," she said. "Not for humanity specifically. For someone. Anyone. A signal that the silence isn't required anymore." She looked at Catry, then at Admiral Chen. "We've been thinking about this as a military problem. It's not only a military problem." The Vax Corey armada around New Horizon was the most impressive display of organized military power Elena had ever seen and probably would ever see. 6 to 7 warships in perfect geometric formation, their positioning a deliberate aesthetic choice as much as a tactical one. The Vax Corey had always understood that intimidation was a force multiplier. Against the blue-green disk of New Horizon and its 3 million inhabitants, it was an image designed to make any rational calculation of resistance feel absurd. Quinn's task force numbered 29 vessels. Supreme Commander Sovic appeared on the view screen with the unhurried confidence of a creature that has never lost, delivering his terms with the particular magnanimity of someone who considers the outcome already determined. Quinn listened to the full surrender demand without interrupting. When Sovic finished, there was a brief, theatrical pause. "You know," Quinn said, "there's a saying we have. It goes, never corner something more dangerous than you." His tone was conversational, the tone of a man making small talk. "I've always found it interesting that the species most likely to need that advice are the ones least likely to heed it." Sovic's tongue flickered. "You have 1 planetary rotation to surrender. Use it wisely." The transmission ended. Elena watched Quinn stare at the blank screen for a moment. "He genuinely believes this is over," she said. "Is counting ships and weapon systems," Quinn replied, "which is completely understandable. That's what you count when you've never fought a war for something you believed in." He turned to his communications officer. "Execute Operation Spotlight. Quantum transmitters across all frequencies. All of it. Aegis, XJ-42, everything we collected." The transmissions went out simultaneously, bypassing official Confederacy channels entirely, reaching civilian receiving equipment on 100 worlds before any diplomatic filtering could intercept them. Elena's original XJ-42 footage, the Aegis recordings, a dozen other files from human intelligence operatives and the survivors of species that had suffered Vax Corey operations in silence for years, believing no one was coming to listen. The galaxy saw, not through government summaries or diplomatic briefings filtered through a Confederacy's careful language of security concerns and sovereign rights. They saw the footage itself, unmediated, unframed, without commentary. Teleran researchers kneeling in submission and being killed for it. Juvenile forms being separated from adults. The same systematic methodology applied, world after world, species after species, across 3 centuries of expansion that the Confederacy had officially characterized as territorial development. Within hours, something happened that no Vax Corey strategic model had apparently accounted for. Civilian populations on Confederacy worlds began to react. Not governments, populations. Protests in major Confederacy centers. Broadcasts from minor species that had been intimidated into silence for decades, suddenly finding that their silence felt different when they understood that someone else had chosen to speak. and from the darkness of space, small stealth courier ships slipped between systems, carrying human diplomats to meetings that had been requested through channels so indirect and careful that they barely left traces. In her makeshift office, Elena welcomed the Teleran representatives. The senior diplomat, elderly, his carapace dull with age, his antennae moving in the slow patterns of someone who had survived more than any being should have to survive, placed a data crystal on the table between them. "Shielding technology," he said through his translator. "We have kept it hidden from the Confederacy for 3 generations. It is not a weapon. It cannot be used to harm anyone." His compound eyes held Elena's gaze. "We give it to you because your species stood between us and death without being asked, without being offered anything in return, with no strategic logic that any other civilization in this galaxy would have accepted as sufficient." His antennae curved forward, the Teleran gesture of deep respect. "You taught us that such things are still possible." Similar conversations were happening across human space. The Mori brought sensor-jamming technology they'd spent a century developing in secret against the day when they might need it. The Pax contributed their matter-phasing drives. The Telerans offered their asteroid shipyards and the industrial capacity to fill them. Former neutrals arrived with data on Vax Corey tactical doctrines that they'd been quietly observing for decades while officially seeing nothing. The fleet around New Horizon grew. Quinn addressed them when it numbered over 100 vessels of 15 species, beings shaped like things that had never shared a planet, who had never fought alongside each other, who had in some cases never been in the same room with each other, standing at their battle stations together. "The Vax Corey expect to surrender today," he said, his voice carried by translation systems across every ship. "What they are going to receive instead is a demonstration of something their civilization has apparently never encountered." He looked at the tactical display, at the Allied icons multiplying hourly. "The galaxy is remembering a truth that has been inconvenient to remember for a very long time, that there is no natural order that elevates cruelty. There is no hierarchy that makes some lives expendable and others sacred. Tyrants retain power only when enough good people choose to do nothing." The grin came back, slower and more genuine than any version Elena had seen from him before. "Today, we're doing something." The Vax Corey home world glittered against the void like something precious. Its orbital defense platforms were works of genuine engineering magnificence, layered, redundant, deep and complex, built over centuries with the assumption that nothing would ever seriously threaten them. The combined fleet emerged from synchronized jump points, and for a long moment, both sides simply existed in each other's presence. Then the battle began. It was fierce and fast and costly, as honest battles always are. The Vax Corey home fleet was formidable on its own ground, fighting with the desperate edge of a force defending something it had never imagined defending. Elena tracked the engagement from the Thermopylae's bridge and kept her names list open in a secondary window, adding to it as reports came in. But the coalition's strength was not technological advantage or superior numbers. It was something that no strategic model the Vax Corey possessed had ever needed to calculate, the particular cohesion of beings fighting for a principle that they had chosen rather than inherited. 15 species, each bringing their specific knowledge and capability, each compensating for the other's vulnerabilities, moving with the practiced fluency of people who had trained together because they believed in what they were fighting for. When the orbital platforms fell, Quinn assembled his delegation. Representatives from every species that had suffered under Vax Corey expansion, Teleran, Mori, Pac, Telerans, and others whose names Elena was still learning to pronounce correctly. They descended to the surface in a shuttle that bore no weapons, and walked into the ancient council chamber of a civilization being held accountable for the first time in its history. Supreme Commander Sovic and the Vax Corey High Council were brought before the assembled tribunal. Sovic looked at them, at the multiplicity of species gathered against him, and Elena watched him understand, perhaps for the first time, what he was actually seeing. Not a coalition of enemies. An answer. "You don't understand what you've done," he said. It came out less like defiance and more like something approaching disbelief. "You've destabilized centuries of galactic order. The Confederacy will never." "The Confederacy," said the Telerans senior diplomat, stepping forward, "has been informed that 43 of its member species are requesting an extraordinary session to reassess the non-interference doctrine." His antennae moved with slow dignity. "The session will begin in 6 days. Several Confederacy officials have already indicated they will support the reassessment." Sovic went very still. "You thought this was about power, Quinn said quietly, about which species was strong enough to impose its will. He shook his head. It was never about that. He looked at Sovic for a long moment, and Elena saw in his expression something complicated. Not hatred, not triumph. The particular sadness of someone who has seen this pattern before and knows exactly how much it costs. It was about who we choose to be, Quinn said. That's the only question that ever actually mattered. The new Galactic Accords took 18 months to negotiate. Elena attended every session she could manage, watching species that had never spoken to each other find language for things they had individually experienced and collectively never been permitted to name. The Confederacy's non-interference doctrine was not abolished. Too many species had too many reasons to value sovereignty, but it was revised fundamentally and irrevocably to distinguish between sovereignty and impunity, to establish, for the first time in 400 years of galactic governance, that there were actions which no civilizational framework had the right to permit, that there were lives which were never expendable. The Vax Corey Supreme Council was held accountable before a tribunal of the species they had harmed, a process that was slow and painful and deeply imperfect, and, Elena thought, exactly as it should be. She stood on the observation deck of Orbital Command on the day the accord was signed, looking out at Earth below her, blue and cloud-wrapped and impossibly fragile-looking from this distance, and thought about a blue-green planet at the edge of human space where she had once made a catastrophically bad tactical decision that had changed everything. "You're thinking too loudly," Quinn said, arriving beside her with 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one. "I'm thinking about the 17%. The survival probability on your strafing run." "Yes." She looked at the coffee. "I keep wondering what happens in the other 83%. What the galaxy looks like if I calculate the odds correctly and decide they are too poor and turn my ship around." Quinn was quiet for a moment, looking out at the Earth below. "The same thing that always happens when the calculation wins," he said. "The killing continues. The silence gets normalized. One more species learns that there's no one coming, and gradually they either make their accommodation with that truth or they disappear." He sipped his coffee. "The galaxy you described exists. It's the galaxy we found when we got out there. It's the galaxy that watched what happened on XJ-42 and decided it was a security matter. And now," Quinn considered the question with the care it deserved, "now the galaxy knows that humans are out here," he said, "and that we will make 17% probability decisions at inconvenient moments." He glanced at her, "which means the calculation has changed for everyone." Below them, Earth turned in its ancient, patient rotation, a world that had produced, across its long and complicated history, both the worst of what civilization could become and the stubborn, recurring, costly insistence that it could become something better. A world that had paid for its lessons in blood and had written them into its children anyway, generation after generation, never again, never again, never again, until finally, the phrase had been said in a chamber of stars. Elena drank her coffee and watched the planet town. "We should probably file the paperwork," she said eventually. Quinn's laugh echoed off the observation deck windows. "There's so much paperwork." "Worth it." He looked at her sideways, the grin returning, the genuine one, the slow one, the one that didn't perform anything. "Ask the Telerans," he said. She already knew the answer. The Galactic Accord were ratified by 127 Confederacy member species in the 43rd year of human spaceflight. They are commonly referred to, in multiple galactic languages, by phrases that translate with reasonable consistency as the human intervention, the year of accountability, and, in the oldest of the Teleran dialects, used by beings who survived XJ-42 and their descendants, simply as the day someone came. The edge of human space was, by every measurable standard, the most boring posting in the United Earth Navy. Lieutenant Elena Rodriguez had memoized every scratch on her scout ship's console, catalogued every quirk of its aging ventilation system, and composed what she privately believed was the universe's most comprehensive mental list of things she would rather be doing. Watching paint dry ranked somewhere in the middle. At least paint dried at a consistent, predictable rate. Out here, nothing happened. Not quickly, not slowly, not at all. She was halfway through a cold cup of synthesized coffee when the ship's AI broke the silence. "Alert, anomalous energy signature detected." The voice was criminally cheerful for 3 in the morning, ship time. Elena set down her cup and straightened in her chair, rolling her neck until it cracked. "Oh, wonderful," she muttered. "Let me guess. Another rogue comet with delusions of grandeur." She pulled up the sensor panel anyway, because regulations demanded it and because she had absolutely nothing else to do. "Where's it coming from? NA6. Planet designation XJ42, approximately 0.3 light hours from current position." Elena frowned. XJ42 was listed as uninhabited in every database she'd ever consulted, a quiet, blue-green world on the outer rim, strategically irrelevant and scientifically unremarkable. It was supposed to be empty. Supposed to be. Show me. The view screen shifted, pulling up a long-range optical scan of a small planet draped in swirling cloud cover. Through the gaps, Elena could see the northern continent, dense with forest, quiet, cold. But the energy readings told a different story. They were concentrated in a single location, sharp and purposeful. Not geological. Not a comet. Something was down there. Elena leaned back and drummed her fingers on the armrest. She thought about the paperwork. She thought about the sensor malfunction she'd investigated before. 3 false alarms in the last 4 months, each one generating a report that nobody at command ever appeared to actually read. Then she thought about how, if she didn't investigate and it turned out to be something significant, the paperwork would be exponentially worse. "Set course," she said. "Standard approach." Course set. Arrival in 22 minutes. She finished her coffee. It was cold and tasted like regret, which felt appropriate. As her ship slid into orbit around XJ42, something changed in the pit of Elena's stomach, a quiet instinct, older than reason, that stood the hair up on the back of her neck. The thermal imaging display painted a picture that had nothing to do with sensor malfunctions. 2 distinct clusters of heat signatures occupied the northern continent. One was stationary, a tight, warm concentration of bodies inside what appeared to be a modest research outpost, the kind of prefabricated structure that scientific teams erected on uninhabited worlds for months or years at a stretch. The other cluster was moving, and it moved with the cold, unmistakable discipline of a military force, spreading outward in practice formations, encircling the stationary group with methodical efficiency. NA6, magnify Sector 4. The image sharpened, and Elena's blood ran cold. The moving signatures belonged to tall, reptilian figures in gleaming black armor. They moved in lockstep, weapons drawn, each motion deliberate and coordinated in a way that spoke of long experience with exactly this kind of operation. Elena recognized the physiological profile immediately, even though she'd only ever seen them in classified briefing documents and blurry long-range reconnaissance photos. The Vax Corey, a species humanity had observed from a careful, respectful distance for the better part of 2 decades, respectful not out of admiration, but out of the kind of quiet, instinctive wariness that one feels in the presence of something fundamentally predatory. They were known throughout the sector for territorial expansion that moved like a slow tide, relentless and consuming, swallowing worlds that nobody at the Galactic Confederacy seemed inclined to notice or mourn. And the smaller figures being herded out of the outpost, stumbling into the pale light of XJ42's morning. Elena leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Telerans. The insectoid researchers were unmistakable, slender, multi-jointed, with wide compound eyes and delicate antennae that currently lay flat against their skulls. Elena had read about them. Most of the galaxy had. The Telerans were among the Confederacy's most celebrated scientific minds, known particularly for their extraordinary advances in biological sciences. They were pacifists by both philosophy and temperament, a species that had chosen knowledge over conquest so long ago the choice had become instinct. They were dropping to their knees, antennae pressed against their heads, their species' most ancient, unmistakable gesture of complete submission. Elena had read about that too, in a xenobiology file she'd skimmed during particularly slow patrol rotation. It was not merely surrender. It was a Teleran equivalent of saying, "We are no threat to you. We give up everything. Please." The Vax Corey response was immediate. Plasma fire erupted from a dozen weapons at once, cutting through the kneeling scientists with business-like efficiency. No hesitation. No negotiation. No acknowledgement whatsoever of the surrender being offered. Elena sat absolutely still for 3 full seconds, watching the thermal signatures wink out one by one.